Today is May 5, 2018. We are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread and have been studying the question of the historicity of the Exodus. And as always, let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to help us. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for guiding not only us, but also those in generations before ours. And thank you for helping us to know at least some of your works in the past. And thank you for showing us, even above that, your character. Help us as we study these various questions of what really happened 3,000 years ago and plus. Help us to understand the truth of these claimed actions of yours. Please help us to know through this study who you are more clearly than ever before, and help us to have a better understanding of all the principles we need to understand in order to have a right character ourselves and also to change the whole world. Thank you. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So, for our recap, I'll mention that our subject, yes, is the historicity of the Exodus, and we are honestly investigating this question. It's not just, we want to come at it in order to confirm some bias. We are certainly seeking to rid ourselves of preconceived ideas. And the reason why we see a need to even study this question is because, unlike before, we now, in light of the things we've been learning in this message, see the need to not just accept whatever the books of, quote-unquote, the Bible say for the simple fact that they are in the Bible. No, we've come to realize that a book's presence in a biblical canon or absence from a biblical canon has nothing to do with, on the one hand, its status of inspiration or even claim to inspiration, and on the other hand, its historical reliability. We've come to recognize that there are writings outside of the various Christian canons that are indeed a product of divine inspiration. And also, there are writings inside Christian canons that are not a product of divine inspiration. There are writings outside of the Christian canons that are historically reliable, and there are writings inside of Christian canons which are historically unreliable. Not only do we need to be willing to investigate the legitimacy of texts with which we have heretofore been unfamiliar, we also need to be open to testing the legitimacy of the writings which compose the canons with which we have grown up or which we have accepted when converting to a certain faith. And not only do we need to question the text, we need to question the traditions concerning the text, and that is certainly something that we have been doing when it comes to the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. It is claimed that these writings were actually written by Moses, by both Jews and Christians, and that has been a popular idea for 2 millennia plus. And we have seen that that claim is actually extra Pentateuchal. It is beyond the Pentateuch. The Torah itself, or the Pentateuch itself, does not actually make that claim. Furthermore, all of the evidence from within the Torah indicates that Moses did not and could not have written it. And ever since last year, we have actually been investigating a certain hypothesis known as the documentary hypothesis, which provides an explanation for who did write the Torah, and essentially says that the Torah is a composite of several originally separate literary documents, 4 primary ones known as J, E, P, and D, and then several smaller literary works as well, and that these writings were stitched together, as it were, through several different editorial processes that took place at different times, stretching over several hundred years. And scholarship on this subject is by no means in a beginning phase. It has been going on for several hundred years, and there's a lot of detailed and thorough research into this. And so far, none of us here on the calls have been able to mention anything which contradicts the documentary hypothesis. No fact which contradicts it, which that doesn't mean it's true, but of course, when a hypothesis is put forward, scientifically speaking, what is supposed to be done is you're supposed to try and falsify it to see, well, is there any information which actually shows that this is not the case? So not only have we found that in spite of testing the hypothesis, it has not yet fallen, we have also found that the hypothesis has a great amount of explanatory power, and it seems to have quite a lot of evidence in its favor. So really, it's standing very strongly to the point where I am really not sure why it is still referred to as the documentary hypothesis. I would think by now it would have been graduated to being a theory, since in science, a hypothesis is an explanation put forward in order to make sense of observations. And in science, a theory is a hypothesis that has been confirmed. It's a hypothesis that has been tested and shown to be in harmony with all the available facts. Essentially, a theory is an explanation of a large amount of facts that that basically not only explains it, but is evident and gives an overall framework within which to view the various individual elements. It seems to be that the so-called documentary hypothesis fits the bill for that. It's an explanation for a large number of facts, and it has stood the test of time and scrutiny, and seems to have, there are several bits of factual information which fit very, very well within the documentary hypothesis and do not seem to fit well in any other scenario. In other words, if it wasn't true, it doesn't quite seem to work. So, with that said, how does this all relate to the Exodus? Well, of course, the Torah is the place from which we have the Exodus story. Sure, there are other places, other writings, which do refer to it. There's several Psalms in the Bible, Isaiah, several of the prophets. There's quite a number of writings that refer to the Exodus, and there are even other writings which actually tell the Exodus story, but the writings which actually go into telling the story are usually considered by historians to be dependent upon the texts of the Torah. So if that is indeed the case, then the Torah is really where we get the Exodus story. I will say that there are some gray areas to that and some questions to go along with that. Where exactly do we draw the line? Because within the Torah, the P source is understood to be dependent upon the combined version of J and E. So they're already within the Torah. You have one source that's dependent upon others, and the P source is understood to come from the 8th century BC, removed from the Exodus event by centuries, and dependent on other sources, again, within the Torah. So what makes that so different from something like the Book of Jubilees, let's say, although it may be removed even further in time? One possible scenario in which the state of the P source versus Jubilees would be different is that perhaps Jubilees is entirely dependent upon the Torah, whereas maybe the P source, while it did know the combined JE, perhaps there were other sources that the P author had that went back as early as J&E or even further. So there's a lot to learn in relationship to this. But in essence, texts that we can look at that we can pretty well verify to be decently ancient, at least in comparison to the other texts which refer to the Exodus, are the texts in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. And now that we can see quite clearly that the Torah is composed of multiple independent texts, or at least multiple separate documents, we can see that this gives us a greater opportunity to do historical research. There's a lot to historical research that cannot be done if you only have one primary source. If you have multiple sources, well, then you can have comparison, and it helps you to kind of triangulate on certain facts. So it is to our advantage that the Torah is not one document, but rather is several documents, some of which are not dependent upon others. And, it puts us in a position where we can actually come to know something about the proposed events mentioned in these various texts more accurately, and that we have a higher likelihood of being able to accurately do this than if it was just one text. But, once again, our purpose is not merely to discover something about history. The Exodus is a proposed event in which Yahweh, the God of Israel, is said to have acted and to have spoken. there are ideas and commands and instructions and thoughts and words which are claimed in the various sources of the Torah to have originated with Yahweh. What is the legitimacy of those claims? We want to know, because we have seen that there are certain activities in history which we can verify to have happened, and in which we can verify Yahweh to have acted. But this event, the Exodus, is really a big deal. It's thought to be the birth of the nation of Israel, and it is thought to be this big action which identifies the God of Israel. There are many places in the Torah where Yahweh is quoted as saying something like, "I am Yahweh, the God of your fathers, who brought you up from the land of Egypt," something like that. So Yahweh is identified as being the God of the Exodus in several texts. Now, as we've seen, the J text actually speaks of Yahweh and actually refers to Yahweh as Yahweh prior to the Exodus event. So it's not that Yahweh and the Exodus are just inseparable, but in a great number of texts, Yahweh and the Exodus are so intimately connected that it's hard to imagine one without the other from the perspective of those texts. So this, again, highlights the importance for us to look at this. Some of the texts that describe the activity of Yahweh in connection to the Exodus portray Yahweh as having a character which is morally corrupt or morally reprehensible, being pro-slavery, and so on. And we certainly reject the idea that that's what our Heavenly Family is like, because we've learned about them through sources that we can verify to come from them. And they're certainly opposed to things like slavery. And in fact, some of the Exodus texts don't have any sort of pro-slavery propaganda, but instead have Yahweh as really being the liberator of slaves. So we have conflicting portraits of Yahweh and conflicting portraits of Moses, his activity and his message, and we really want to get to the bottom of it, because all of the other, I'll just say at least many of the other messages that have come since the days of Moses are dependent upon Moses' message. It builds upon it, is perhaps a better way to put it. So we have been recognizing our kind of, not so much a dilemma, but just the reality of our circumstance, in that our focus is not primarily historical, although that is certainly, a big part of it, but we aren't studying this history for the sake of history. We are studying it because it is very relevant in the present and has a lot to do with how we view the character of our Heavenly Family. And as we have been studying in the Gospel of Truth, knowing the character of God is actually very important, and coming to know God, and the Gospel of Truth emphasizes the Father. Knowing the Father is hugely important. So,
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So knowing the Father is hugely important. That Jesus came to show us the Father. So it's not. So basically, what I'm just wondering for the first time is there something beyond the life of Jesus that we're supposed to be looking to? Now, obviously, if we can pinpoint the historicity of some of these things in the Old Testament that are claimed to be commands by Yahweh or claimed to be actions of Yahweh, well, that's certainly going to be along the lines of that. But with Jesus, saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Right. Yeah, I was actually, in response to what you were saying, that's actually what I was going to mention, that, when Jesus' disciples asked him, show us the Father, he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. At least that's the way it's portrayed in the Gospel of John.
And what an interesting request. Why would they ask that?
Yeah, very, very interesting. Perhaps because he spoke of his Father so much and emphasized his Father so much. But again, the Apocryphon of James kind of throws an interesting light on this, because in the Apocryphon of James, Jesus repeatedly speaks of needing to go to his Father, not because his Father needs him, but because he needs his Father. And in the Gospels, the dependence of Jesus upon his Father is overwhelming. So this indicates that the Father is special. Jesus learned what he learned from the Father. And so, yes, Jesus is the way. But again, he's showing us how to come into contact with the Father, and he's teaching us what he's learning from the Father, because the Father is very wise. The Father is the one who established the order of the kingdom of heaven, and we need to be freed from the chaos of the kingdoms of darkness which are presently ruling this world, and we need to have a restoration of order, and that is really what the Father can bring about. So that's why we really need to become acquainted with the Father. And because of that, we need to have a knowledge of who he is. And the Gospel of Truth vividly portrays, in harmony with the testimony of Ellen White, we might add, that the way sin arose was through a misunderstanding of the Father's character. That certainly needs to be corrected. So, yeah, when it comes to the Exodus and our study of it, our circumstance is that we are studying this for very broad and important purposes. But in order to really get to the bottom of it, we have to get into the nitty-gritty of the history. So we have been focusing on that. And even though it has been, in a way, kind of slow going, I mean, out of all the information that we have on this subject, we have covered only a small percentage of it. Yet, I think we have made some progress, and we've been focusing on the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, which is thought by historians to be the earliest source on the Exodus, maybe even contemporary, or at least very nearly contemporary. And each night we have learned something more about it. We don't yet have a full grasp of exactly what it is, what it portrays, when it was written, what historical value it has, and so on. But I think we are getting closer to that. And tonight, I hope we advance that further. So, with all that said, there are a few things that we kind of left off with last night, and hopefully we can return to that and make some headway with it. But we were trying to figure out when exactly this was written, and we took note of the fact that in verses 14 to 16 of Exodus 15, it describes how the inhabitants of Canaan, as well as Edom and Moab, which is just southeast of Canaan, how they heard of this event at the sea, and they trembled, and they were afraid. And we realized that in order for that song to be written, the author of it would have to be aware of the response of the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Edomites, the Moabites, etc., to the news of this event at the sea with Pharaoh's army. And in order for the author of this text to be familiar with that response, well, those various peoples would have had to hear of the event, and it takes a little bit of time. So in J, this song is placed on the lips of Moses and the children of Israel practically right after the event itself. And that simply could not be. There must have been time, for the song to be written, there must have been time for this news to travel to the peoples in Canaan and the surrounding areas, and for the author of the song to become aware that that was the response. So we looked at that, and then we looked at some other elements, particularly in verse 17, which describes Yahweh bringing a people and planting them in his holy place or his sanctum, his sanctuary. And the question is, where exactly is that? And does a reference to that help us to date the composition of this song? And one of the things that we notice is that in some translations, that event in verse 17 is spoken of as an event yet future from the writing of the song. And in some translations, it is spoken of as a past event. So that's important in determining really when this was written, and knowing when it was written may in fact be very helpful in determining its historical value. So, all that said, does anyone have any comments or questions?
We were reading the J and the E source as a group today, and just like talking about knowing the Father, it's really interesting, especially in the E source. Like, it sort of allows us to question, you know. Like I feel like in the past, you know, we probably didn't feel that way, but now you can read the E source, and we've talked about things like slavery and like that, but you know, in the E source, I mean, God is, you know, doing these horrible things to the Egyptians, you know, things that it seems like would not fit the character of God at all. And it just, I don't know, it's just kind of freeing to actually be able to think freely about what we're looking at in the Pentateuch, and understanding the documentary hypothesis kind of allows us to do that.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? I totally can agree to that and relate to that experience.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think it's really awesome that we have something available like this, the Bible with sources revealed, to make it easier to understand. And of course, I think we've basically been discussing that anyway, but I just wanted to say it. For me, it's really been helpful to have them separated like that, and it's probably divinely brought about for us in these days. What do you think?
Well, considering the history of scholarship, I would certainly say that our Heavenly Family had their hand in that, because of the fact that we don't have any record of people really reading the Bible in a critical way until the Protestant Reformation. So if it wasn't for people like Luther, there would never have been a modern biblical scholarship. And in a way, it's sad to say that modern biblical scholarship has continued on in principle the spirit of Protestantism far better than the Protestant churches, even including Adventism, and included within Adventism, Davidia, and the Branch. I mean, modern biblical scholarship has been willing to question things far beyond what people in the churches have, and obviously that's a positive thing. I should also point out, though, that it's not to be totally exclusive. I mean, it's not like nobody in the churches participates in biblical scholarship. No, to the contrary, there are many scholars who are members of different churches, but it's not a denominational endeavor, nor is it a theological one. And there are scholars engaged in this sort of study from all sorts of faiths and non-faiths. And this just shows, it's just another example of how a discipline which is scientific in its approach is simply better and brings about unity. I mean, virtually all scholars on the Pentateuch agree with some form of the documentary hypothesis. That's an incredible amount of unity. And this is, people of all sorts of faiths and non-faiths who agree on these subjects because of the evidence. I mean, that's just awesome. So, yeah, pretty cool.
I don't know the exact right words to say this, but, dogma, everybody just believes in the Bible dogmatically. And, that it could be that the Branch message, the new song, actually is, revealing the true character of God through these, falsehoods that are in the Bible, like actually making understood to theologians for the very first time that there are issues within the Bible and that the true character of God is also in the Bible, but we need to separate, the truth from the falsehood. And that very well may be the new song.
Yeah, I have to actually agree with that because, and I would say that there are other ways to explain what the new song is that, it's not that it differs with that in terms of disagreement, but there are several ways to explain exactly what it is. But ultimately, without what you just described, you can't really have the new song, because one of the, if not the most fundamental principle of this message just comes down to dealing with reality on its own merits. And that includes the texts in quote-unquote the Bible. And when we deal with it on its own merits, yeah, it is absolutely helpful to see texts which actually present a false set of morals and a false picture of God for what they are. And it's also helpful to see texts which present a true set of morals and the true character of God for what they are, because both of those have been missed. You know, most people read the Bible and miss the fact that passages like Exodus 21 actually really do promote slavery. And passages like Psalm 137 really do promote the killing of infants. People miss that, and yet when we read it, it influences how we view God. And then at the same time, people read passages that describe the two ways and that describe the character of God as being wholly righteous and describe the gospel and the moral system of truth-based morality and how we can be saved from error by abiding in the truth. We read that and we miss what that's saying too. So it's like people have been living in this artificial gray zone. Really, I really like how the gospel of truth portrays it. People living in a dream. And it's like a nightmare, and it's like you're killing your neighbor and you have your neighbor's blood on you or something, or you're running from someone but there's no one chasing you, or, you know, like there's just this weird existence, and those who wake up realize that, hey, it was really nothing. It was just a deception. So I've been enjoying kind of discussing a bit more about the principles involved with this, and I'm glad that you guys have been reading from the sources and being able to experience the joy of being able to just honestly question. So if there's more that anyone wants to say in relation to the principles involved in all of what we're doing and what we're going through and the experience of that, feel free. Otherwise, if no one else has anything like that to say, mention so, and then we'll kind of focus back in on Exodus 15 and the Song of the Sea. And actually, if anyone has anything to say regarding it, if anyone's looked into it more and has found anything, you can feel free to mention that.
Yeah, I just want to say regarding to like the song in Exodus, when you know how we're like talking about Philistia's residents and Edom's chiefs and Moab's chieftains and Canaan's residents, when they were when tear and fear came over them, and how that the song must have been written after these tribes, I guess, found out. And that had to take some time because when the message has to travel across back then, it probably did take more time than it does now. I was just thinking that because I'm not exactly sure when these tribes were like brought about, like maybe they were all existed at the same time. Like Philistia's, Edom's, and Moab's, and Canaan's, maybe they existed around the same year, or, around the same year, then it had to have been written within that year, or around after that. But if, like, let's say, Edom's chiefs didn't come maybe a few months after Philistia's was around, and then the next tribe didn't come around like a few months after that, and let's say like about the times that those tribes didn't exist came about took around a year or so, then that might help determine when it could have been written. And from other calls while we were investigating certain things, I do remember one of the principles that we're supposed to look at when we're investigating is that when it starts to add other people in their story, or when they're talking about somebody, or like there's an issue going on between another person, but then outside of that issue with that person, they brung in somebody else, like another witness in a way, then it's like, why would they bring somebody else in unless that person was aware of that situation that has happened? But yeah, that's what I came about with.
Sure, yeah. It's pretty interesting how, when reading something like this, usually what people would do is just assume, oh, well, this is describing, it mentions the, Edom and Moab and Canaan and Philistia. So obviously at the time this is describing them, they had to exist. That's how people would think about it. But in light of what we've learned already about the Torah, we should actually question that. So I'm glad that you're mentioning that. There are instances, like, for example, in Genesis chapter 12, when it talks about Abraham, or at the time he was referred to as Abram, it says that he came from Ur of the Chaldees. And it's really interesting because the Chaldees, or the Chaldeans, did not even exist in Abraham's time. It wasn't actually for centuries after that, and it wasn't controlled by Ur until even after. And what's even more significant is that the Chaldeans did not control Ur until hundreds of years after the time of Moses even. So that's one of the evidences that Moses did not write the Torah, because really it's referring to a reality that did not exist in Moses' day. So that's something that we can definitely apply here. And I'm just wondering if anyone would like to offer any insight into that in terms of the existence of the Philistines or the Edomites or Moabites or Canaanites, and kind of the range of dates in which each of those peoples were in existence.
I just know that the Moabites didn't they come from Lot's descendants, the Moabites?
So here's a question. If there's a text in the Torah which claims that the Moabites came from Lot's descendants, does that mean that the Moabites came from Lot's descendants?
Of course not.
Yeah, I figured that that's how you would reply. So here's the thing. It does it may even be in the J source, actually. I could be wrong on that. But in Genesis, yes, it does describe the descendants of Lot, at least some of them becoming the Moabites. But just more generally speaking, I think it's important for us to question exactly how different people groups originated, because very often basically, if you read the Torah, it explains the origins of many different people groups, or it offers explanations. And the way that it explains the origins of people groups is by saying that, oh, these people are the descendants of that person. But is that actually always the case? Like, is that how people groups really form? Is this how nations and tribes and all of that actually form? So that's something that's kind of like getting into social anthropology and stuff like that. But that's something that we definitely should gain a fuller understanding of. So when you read Genesis, you kind of have like in the genealogy, like, oh, this person is the father of metal workers. This person is the father of all who dwelt in tents, and, you know, kind of like pinning the origin of a whole bunch of different things to a particular individual. And then you have things like Noah's 3 sons, and, oh, well, this son was the ancestor of all these groups of people, and so on for all 3 sons. And then each of those sons had different sons, and their sons kind of correspond to larger nations. I think it's just worth it for us to question whether that's actually how it all went down, especially since the way that we see nations forming today seems to be different from that, where it's not so simple as everyone's descended from this one person, you know? So does anyone else have any insight into like the origins of the Philistines or Edomites or Moabites or Canaanites, and even if it's not exact origins, do people have knowledge of when these people groups were in existence? Well, I guess we haven't read all of the writings of the ancient Near East yet.
Yeah.
But anyway, these are the sorts of things that we can research and find answers to. And there's a lot of information. Like, we can search on Google. There's a lot of ancient Near Eastern texts available online. If you look on the resources page of the BDSDA website, you can come across a whole lot of stuff. And, you know, Egypt was a major power in the world at the time of the Exodus, and prior to then for a long time, and after then for a long time. And so there's Egyptian records of a lot of different things. And so that's one resource to look at. And there's also archaeology, which gives us a whole lot. And within archaeology, there's text, there's pictures, there's sites, you know, like actual locations with buildings and so on. So I don't know exactly when the Philistines arrived in the land of Israel, but to my knowledge, it was at like potentially even before 1200 BC. I think it was before that. So 1200 BC is kind of like the transition from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, and that's how archaeologists typically divide time. And I think that the Philistines showed up during the Bronze Age rather than in the Iron Age. The Canaanites were certainly there for a long time prior to the Exodus. That's known from Egyptian sources, from archaeology in the land of Israel, and there's plenty of sources on the existence of the Canaanites in the land. And to my knowledge, the Edomites and Moabites were there prior to the Exodus as well as separate peoples. And I think that there's, again, a combination of evidence for that from Egyptian sources and archaeological sources. But you guys can go and search that online to find the answer to that. So we've been on for almost a full hour already. It's kind of interesting how our meetings have felt so short when we're keeping them to an hour in some ways. But it's just because we're used to having them longer than that. What do you guys think? Let me just ask you guys for some feedback on the length of our meetings, being at around 1 hour. How are you guys all feeling about that so far during the feast?
My mind is only good for about an hour.
I think it's been good during the feast, with the calls every night and everything. And it, especially with the topic, like it gives us a chance to, because it sort of tickles your brain on some different ideas during the meeting. And so you can kind of, after the call, dig into whatever's been, the issue that you've been thinking about.
Okay, cool. I'm thinking that keeping it at an hour is pretty good then. And so with that said, we're basically done tonight's call. And we have some food for thought as we kind of continue to contemplate this subject overall. So would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
Dear Heavenly Family, thank you for helping us to be able to study as a group and to learn how to study better and better, to be able to prove all things. And we just pray that you'll be with us all this evening as we go our separate ways, finish studying or whatever we're doing. Be with family and friends that are not with us, and pray that you'll watch over us and give us your protection and lead us into all things that you want us to know. We ask this in the name of your Son and daughter. Amen.
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 Shalom, everyone.
Shalom. Good night.
Shalom.